My name is Norman Wirzba, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar series entitled Facing the Anthropocene. In case you are unfamiliar with the term, the Anthropocene marks the unprecedented moment when some human beings became a dominant force in planetary history, responsible for the widespread alteration of the world's land, ocean, and atmospheric systems. Though planetary systems and biological processes are still clearly at work, their expressions and effects can no longer be understood apart from human activity. Ranging from the cellular to the atmospheric levels, there is no place or process on Earth that does not reflect in some way humanity's technological prowess and its economic reach. The advent of the Anthropocene compels a rethinking of several fundamental questions, like the following. What sort of human being is the human being that now exerts this outsized power? To what end should this power be directed? And how can we determine when power becomes irresponsible? How should we speak about the world when concepts like nature or the natural no longer seem to hold? Can we speak of the world as sacred? And if so, how would we do that? Also, what are the basis for thinking about and exercising hope? It is unlikely that the frames of thought that brought us to this moment are sufficient to help us imagine and implement a better future, which is why this is now a time for deep and rigorous questioning. And that is what this webinar series is about. And just so that you know, we invite you to join in this questioning by having questions prepared. You will see in your Zoom window that there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your questions there because we will have opportunity to take some of them up toward the conclusion of our conversation today. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest for today, Janet Soskice, who was for many years Professor of Philosophical Theology at the University of Cambridge in England, and now has more recently joined Duke as the William K. Warren Distinguished Research Professor of Catholic Theology. In her work, she has explored philosophy of religion, the nature of religious language and metaphor, how we speak about gender ethics, and also the teaching of creation. Her books include Metaphor and Religious Language, The Kindness of God, Sisters of Sinai, How Two Lady Adventurers Discovered the Lost Gospels, and her forthcoming book is tentatively titled Naming God. So we are delighted to have you with us today, Janet, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you very much, Norman, for this, and indeed for this webinar series and for the whole project that's given rise to it, which brings together a really diverse group of people. And in fact, I must admit at our first meeting, when I was meeting these anthropologists and forensic historians and experts on ecology, I wondered what my contribution could be as a theologian and philosopher of religion to such a joint project. Partly, we're not all coming from a religious point of view, indeed. And there's a real question of whether theology can speak into a secular and utterly pragmatic and important space. But it's Norman's conjecture that it can. And I think that I hope that he's proven right. And in any case, there's certainly been unexpected lines of convergence in our work thus far, and indeed in these webinars. And I want to pick up on it too in my theme today, which will be creation. Because to my joy, two of our previous webinar speakers have broached this theme. Tim Ingold, the cultural anthropologist in his first, and then Kate Rigby in her more recent webinar on the creation narratives. And both speakers have picked out the wavering and varying place of human beings and human agency in accounts of creation and in creation narratives. Kate rightly pointed out that creation narratives such as that we get in the first chapter of Genesis, but in other religious species of narrative, are not primarily concerned with cosmogenesis, that is, the explanation of how the physical world came into being, but with questions of meaning, value, and purpose. Human beings, she said, out of these narratives are the only earthlings, her term, who seem to puzzle over their own existence. Well, that's something I want to pick up. And of course, it's the theme of the whole series, because as Norman said in his introductory remarks, what sort of human beings are we that exert this power? What sort of world can we build together? And how can we hope? Well, to creation, the term creation, of course, implies a creator. And in normal speech today, people will move casually and without much concern between speaking of nature, the natural order, the natural world, and creation. But of course, creation implies a creator. Yet somehow, in the early modern period, the creator has been rather lost or transmuted. So creation means simply the natural order, something like that. And there's been much more talk about nature. And this, of course, was a period that corresponded with immense progress and welcome progress in the natural sciences. Yet the shift from speaking of creation to speaking of nature was marked at the time as not being without its limitations. So a Jewish rabbi in London in the 17th century, Rabbi Nieto, observed that Jews don't believe in nature. He said, we believe in creation. Now, what's the difference? Creation always comes as a gift. It always comes from a giver. Nature doesn't have to be. It could be something that's just there for us to commodify and quantify. And indeed, that's part of the advantage of the term nature in the early modernist period. Part of the idea of the Enlightenment is to get away from too much religious rhetoric. Not that these people weren't necessarily themselves religious, but they wanted perhaps to speak in an enlightened term that got away from classical categories. Still, that leaves us with some unusual language. How do we talk about the gifts of nature, for instance, as some economists do? Who is the giver of the gifts of nature? Well, Rabbi Nieto was writing, I should say he was writing in the early 18th century, not the 17th. He was writing in a time of immense admiration for Newton. And Newton had the greatest of impact on his contemporaries and on all those who inhabited the age of self-denominated the age of reason. There's enormous confidence in the works of man, and I will use this term in an exclusive sense, the works of man and the power of man, to see even into the mind of God. And with this was an attendant picture of the creator, because these were not necessarily unreligious people, but they had a particular theology, in Newton's case, a deistic one. And the world was seen rather like an immensely complex clock into whose working we could put our little levers, and God was the cosmic clockmaker. Man then was in a very privileged position, able to see into the very heart of nature and manipulate its passive features. So the poet Alexander Pope coined a famous couplet, which I believe to be ironic. I hope it is. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. But indeed, the achievements of this period can't be dismissed, nor yet can the vainglory. And this exalted view of man sometimes entailed the degraded picture of God and what it was to be the creator. As Tim Ingold made this point in his first webinar, and I was delighted to see it coming from an anthropologist who isn't a theologian. Aquinas, he said, would not have recognized his God, who is the creator of existence itself, in this cosmic clockmaker whose ways can be accurately deciphered by his earthly adjutant, man. Nonetheless, theologians in the 18th and 19th century, in the English-speaking world at least, were happy enough to roll around with this sidekick status. Now, Enlightenment man, in this sense, has been the subject of critical scrutiny for some time from philosophers such as Charles Taylor and Alistair MacIntyre, as has the rendering of nature as a passive platform for unbridled human agency. But I would like to point to something a little different. I would like to speak to our anthropology, the subsequent loss of the human place in the world, which ironically seems to have been the result of this overweening assessment of human capacities and wisdom. For if we place ourselves on the side of God, over and against the rest of the created order, as a lot of the rhetoric this period did, with a sort of man and God on one side and inert nature on the other side, we soon find ourselves orphans. We soon find ourselves, as 19th century writers said, inhabiting a disenchanted universe without meaning or purpose. We can study this purpose, but what is our place in it? Who is the we, as Norman Wirzba has said in various of these seminars? Who is the we? What are we? These controversies came to a head in Darwin, with Darwin. Could it be that human beings are just animals like any other? The notion at the time in the 19th century startled and alarmed people because human beings seem to have lost their status. And if we're just part of the relentless unfolding of impersonal causes, what is the point of human being at all? Well, you might say the existential crisis is not new. It's perhaps the oldest of themes. Dante begins his great work, the Commedia, famously by saying, "In the middle of the ways of our lives, I found myself in a dark wood." He places himself lost, but he places himself in a collective, we, in the middle of the way of our lives. So he's identifying a situation he takes to be relatively universal, as did Augustine in his Confessions, when he says at a certain stage, I had begun to be a problem to myself. But I think now we're finding ourselves in a slightly different situation. Now we, not just I, we collectively, we human beings, have been a problem to ourselves. Who are we in this great scope of things? Are we just one more collocation of chemical atoms that have no meaning and no purpose whatsoever? We might find 19th century distress over being identified with animals amusing, but there is an existential and philosophical form that distresses more people than one might imagine of this loss of status. And so the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who is decidedly not a religious person, formulates a rather modern sense of loss in his essay entitled Secular Philosophy and the Religious Temperament. Here, Nagel observes that religions variously and characteristically offer some understanding about the relationship of individual human life to the universe as a whole. How, he asks, can this be done in a secular world? How can one bring into one's individual life a recognition of one's relation to the universe as a whole, whatever that relation is? This is not, he continues, just an expression of curiosity. It's rather a question of attitude. And poignantly, he says, I think, is there a way to live in harmony with the universe and not just in it? I think this feeling that we're just living in the universe, gazing at it from the outside, is something that many people can identify with, a sort of lost feeling that any order of the universe is the ordering of our own being, a kind of cosmic loss. Well, let me turn again to the doctrine of creation, not the story of the 7 days, which Kate Rigby has talked about, the creation narratives. That is not the Christian doctrine of creation. And indeed, the idea that the Christian doctrine of creation was that the world is made in 7 units of 24 hours is simply not true. In fact, the early theologians of the church noted that sun and the moon are only made quite after a few days have gone by. So these couldn't have been days in our sense. But the doctrine of creation that is encapsulated in the creeds and begins the creeds is that God made everything that is. This is, in the formal lingo of theology, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And it's derived from scripture, from Genesis, of course, but also from the Psalms, from the prophets, the idea that all that is has its being from God, absolutely everything. And it means everything, including space and time. It's a radical conception of divinity. And as I said, it's found in the ancient creeds and consistent through to modern times. As Tim Engold said in his webinar, God creates existence itself. Well, what difference does this admittedly, seemingly rather abstract notion of creation make to our self-understanding? Actually, it makes a lot. First of all, this teaching that God created everything that is excludes a dualism to which Christianity and other religious traditions are constantly prone, whereby the spirit is good and matter is bad, or flesh. That kind of dualism is prohibited because God creates everything, as the Nicene Creed says, visible and invisible. So angels and the human soul are no less creatures than kangaroos and kumquats. Our own bodies are good, something often contested, and of a unity with other created reality. Well, second, doesn't this make God far away and remote, the creator of space and time? No, in fact, as we see very clearly in Augustine and other early theologians, quite the opposite. As the one who creates and holds all things in being, there is, as Augustine pointed out in his Confessions, no place where God is not, no time where God is not. And this, it should be said, is true of all creatures and not just of sentient ones, not just of human beings. It's true of all creatures that God is present in this intimacy to them immediately, to rodents and fungi, and even to oceans, as the psalmists will say. Now, thirdly, as Tim Ingold pointed out, the moment of creation is now. Creation isn't something that happened a long time ago and then the earth has just been left piddling along. No, God is creating now. God is actively holding all that is in being. It's sometimes said that God's greatest gift to us is life. And surely that's a great gift for us and for all sentient creatures. But we might ask, what is God's greatest gift to oceans? I think if we have the idea that God gives being itself, then we think that God's greatest gift to oceans is their being what they are. The Victorian theorist and art critic John Ruskin was deeply shocked by Darwin's views. He was apparently revolted by the idea that human beings are somehow related to or even descended from mollusks. But surely the proper theological response to the question, surely we're not animals, would be to say that one can't object to the insistence that we are all creatures. What else might we be? We are creatures as much as mollusks and sea cows. And the more we know about the created order, the more we see the profound unity undergirding all of its elements. This is a lesson we've learned only, if only in the negative, by the Anthropocene crisis. What we wear affects the ice caps. Our gut bacteria determine our daily health. Hence, I think, part of the impetus in theology of today to recover some theology of participation in which we are part of this whole created order and indeed participate in God's loving creative plan. So this teaching that God is the source of all that is not lost. It was a bit occluded, I think, in the early modern period by its deistic tendencies. But I also want to point out that it's not a teaching which is exclusive to Christianity or Judaism or Islam, although it is one that unites all three. But it's found in variants in ancient philosophy and in Eastern religions and metaphysics. And at its most basic, it involves the conviction that everything that is gift, and we are one with this gifted whole. So it is that in the Divine Comedy, Dante can make the pagan poet Virgil his guide, because Virgil, though not a Christian, is a good and just man. And Dante believed, as apparently did St. Paul, that it should be evident to all that the world is made for and guided to the good, and that all rightly ordered things, and indeed all life, moves towards the good. I think it's appropriate to mention Dante here because this year is its 800th anniversary of his death, but there's so many things we can learn from Dante. And Dante, although venerating Virgil very much, has smuggled some Christian assumptions into his Virgil's views, notably the identification of the good to which all things tend with God. Nonetheless, for millennia, the basic understanding in the Christian West has been that the rightly ordered life was good, not just in terms of its calculated outcomes or ethical actions, but because it reflected the order of the cosmos itself. Now, in some ways, this idea of unity to all creation is more plausible in modern scientific understanding than ever it could be in the mechanistic models with which Newton and his contemporaries work, where matter was viewed as akin to tiny inert particles clanking against each other in the void. We now believe that the world, or creation, if you like, is more likely to be considered as made of energy, transmuted into different forms. And strangely, this understanding is far more akin to the ancient narratives of creation than is Newton's divine clockmaker. Thus, John's gospel begins to talk about the word. In the beginning was the word, and that all things came into being from this word, in him and through him, this light that shines in the darkness. Dante famously believed that it was love that held the world together. And we should understand that the way he ends this great poem, the Commedia, by saying that it is love that moves the sun and other stars, was for Dante a literal truth, figuratively expressed, of course. For God is love, holding all in wondrous unity. If you can prefer, you can say that it is energy that moves the stars, sun and other stars, or being itself. But whatever means you find, we need to recover our sense of ourselves, not just the individual self, but the collective we, as an intimately part of this cosmic unity. We're not strangers, even estranged from our own body on the outside looking in, but deeply integrated to this whole. And that may be a wonderful lesson we can learn out of this Anthropocene crisis, which indeed we can hope to expand into positive action. Now, I'd probably better end there, and I will, and hope that other points may come out in our Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Janet. There's a lot for us to talk about. And again, a reminder to webinar participants that you now have the opportunity to pose some questions for Janet in the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So first, so many good themes to take up, Janet, and I want to start with the theme of creation ex nihilo, which you in one of your writings say it's a rupture in speech. Mm-hmm. Because as you point out, the idea of creation ex nihilo is simply foreign to, say, Plato and Aristotle. Nothing can come from nothing. Mm-hmm. And yet Christians had this very strange way of speaking. And I want to ask you if the crisis in speech that creation ex nihilo causes for the way we speak about God is also a crisis in speech for the way we talk about the world as creation. Mm-hmm. Right? Because one way we might talk about the Anthropocene is that we're at a loss about how to name the world, given that naming is a way of describing how we relate to what we have named as one way or another. Mm-hmm. Do you have some reflections about how the crisis in speech related to creation, when speaking of God as the creator, might also have some purchase for the way we think about naming the world?
Well, I think I do. And of course, a lot depends on how we use the terms we use and what we mean by them. Because I think in the early modern period, denominating the created order as nature was a way of distancing ourselves, because people then thought of themselves as something rather separate from nature, as sort of in the imago Dei, in the sense that there's nature out there, and that's to do with animals and things, and there's us. Now, I think, of course, that was a heretical way of thinking, because what are we if not creatures? I mean, if we'd kept on this more positive account of creation is creating, the big difference is between God and everything else, which turns out not to be a difference at all, because God is intimately present to all created order. But if we begin to think of ourselves, of nature as something out over and against us, I think we can get to this disenchanted universe. Now, not everyone who uses the term nature will be thinking of it that way, right. But I do think there is an element in our thought of this I sense it in my students. I sense it in my students in England and in students I've had elsewhere and at Duke, of a loss of feeling our lives are integrated, our lives in the way we inhabit our moral lives, our physical lives, our biological lives, need to be integrated. And I think that's why I was struck by this sadness, this sort of remorse, religion remorse that that we find in some of the philosophers.
Yeah, so let's follow this up because this is, I think, a really, really important point.
Mm.
When you talk about how there is a movement to speaking about the world as nature, of course, many things follow because partly nature is not a univocal term. It means multiple things to different people at different times. But historians who speak about modernity, people like Charles Taylor, for instance, will describe how the drive toward objectivity is a way of lessening the moral hold of reality upon our lives. And it seems to me that the reduction or the movement away from creation to nature signals that, because to speak of the world as created in a theological sense is to speak of a world in which, as you say, God is intimately present. And so is it this inability to perceive the intimate presence of God in the world that is, as you might say, part of our difficulty, that we can't fathom the possibility that God is near, or that God, being the animating breath within things, makes any practical difference?
Well, there's several issues here. There's the theological issue, the one that as it were, the diminution of theology, that we get a faraway God and we don't see what we find so often in the mystic writers and so on. They're saying God is nearer to them than their own hands and feet. And I don't think they're saying this because they've had some necessarily profound mystical experience that isn't open to all of us, but because they're just, sometimes it's just a philosophical reflection on what it is for God to be God and be totally present as creator to all God's creatures. But I am also aware of the broader cultural problem, because as our team is not all Christian thinkers. And I don't want to just speak into that Christian space. I'm happy to speak in. I'm a theologian. I speak into that Christian space. But it seems to me interesting that this idea of being ordered to the good was a great strand in Greek philosophers who didn't have the notion of creation ex nihilo. They did have other ideas of a good towards all things ended, and it is found in other religious traditions. And I think that that's why I wanted to go back to the idea of what seems to subtend all of it is the idea of receiving it as a gift. And again, Tim Ingold brought that up indirectly in his first webinar, that the world, it isn't there as a sort of completely plastic for us to do everything with. We have to be attentive to it. And this is partly where I wanted to go, had I not perhaps consumed so much time in my remarks, that what this calls us back to is a kind of ecstasis where we attend to what is given, and where we stop focusing on ourselves perhaps so much, and we attend to what is given. There's a profound release just at a micro level. I've found a lot of people saying to me, both my students and friends, that in a lockdown in these times, they've been stuck in the same room, zooming away, but there's been a flowering bush outside or a daffodil or something, and they've seen it unfold in a way they've never, because they've never been trapped in one room for so long. They've never sat and watched it. And I wouldn't wish a pandemic on anyone to get this kind of insight. But yet I think a lot of us have become aware of the need to just get outside ourselves and attend to the other. And this attending to others, the other, which can be a plant, unfolds into a profound attending to other people as well. It unfolds into our ethical lives. Simone Weil was a great philosopher of this, as you know.
Yeah, I want to come back to the theme of gift and the theme of attention, because they're so important for our conversation today. But I want to pause for a minute and ask you to elaborate a bit more on something which you allude to, but you've written specifically about, which is that it's a mistake to think that the teaching of creation is about how it began a long, long time ago,
Mm.
But as you were saying just more recently about that creation is a description of an order that is good and that life flourishes when it is ordered toward the good, which is another way of saying that, at least theologically described, you shouldn't speak about creation without speaking of salvation, or to use
Mhm.
another fancy term, eschatology, the end or purpose of
Mhm.
things.
Mhm.
Can you say a little bit about why you think those have become separated in the minds of people, whether it's Christian people or non, that we think about creation as being about origins, but not so much about purpose, meaning, healing, salvation?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, there fairly there are probably many reasons for all of these things, but let's try to um, just get on with a few. I think that in the Western Church, perhaps especially, I don't want to make a great, present the Eastern Church as perfect in every way. It's not. But in the Western Church, particularly, there's been since the medieval period a great focus on damnation and salvation, not going to hell, that kind of thing. And it manifests itself in different ways in Catholic and Protestant thought. But nonetheless, there was a loss, in a sense, of a wider sense of salvation, which one finds still in someone like Aquinas, where he uses the term salus, which means health. What we're seeking is our health. And in this is a long line of um, thought, which goes that all things naturally seek the good. In the Christian writers like
Mhm.
Augustine and many of the early theologians and Aquinas, all things naturally seek the good. Augustine will say that it's just like a stone rolling downhill. It's inevitable, but we are mistaken. Unlike stones rolling downhill, we can be mistaken about our goods. And he felt, and as did Dante, this is a part of the created order. Like a sunflower naturally seeks the sun. It doesn't have free will, so it turns back and forth. Uh, and it can't mistake its own good. But if a sunflower had free will and it said, okay, well, actually, I'm a very independent sunflower, so I'd like to sit in a dark garage, it wouldn't do very well because it doesn't understand that it's good. It is good is to seek the source of its being. And of course, they understood the same is true of us, that we are creatures of free will, and we always seek the good, but as Aquinas very pointedly pointed out, we mistake our goods. We think it's better to send my whole salary at the casino rather than buying new shoes for my children or something like that. That's not to desire the good, but it's to be mistaken, to have disordered goods. And so there's a lot of talk about ordering our lives towards the good. And a lot of this reflected in talk about habit and an orientation towards the good. Now, this is a gradual process, of course, and this salus pointing towards the good, and it's continual in Christian life. And I suppose in perhaps in the medieval and early modern West, we got more in the idea that salvation is either you're in or you're out or this and that, and we got away from that kind of linking of to health, to a full health that was the health of the full body oriented to God, and because loving God, loving the neighbor, and properly loving oneself. Those three all imply one another.
Mm. That's so important. And I love the analogy of the sunflower. I think it's a really good one. And what you're saying means then that many Christians have been very confused about salvation insofar as they think it's an issue of transportation, right? Escaping to some other world after we die.
Mhm.
And what you're saying is that it's much more about transformation, not transportation somewhere else, but the transformation of desire and life, so that the desire to escape becomes irrelevant almost,
Mm.
which is a
Well,
very
I
different
think
way of
there's
speaking.
a continuity that,
Yeah.
um, I think most Christians recognize this, that, coming into the fullness of life doesn't just happen when you die. It happens as a result of a Christian life and an unfolding. And it's not, of course, magic every day, not at all.
Yeah.
But it's this continuity. I think a lot of, in my own case, because I was not brought up particularly religious And after I sort of got religious, it was a couple of years before I thought, oh yeah, that'll mean life after death. But it didn't come as, oh wow, yippee, I was so worried about that. Rather, I thought, well, this joy, this life that I know here is constant, it is everlasting, it is the everlasting love of God, and it will continue. So I think that those kind of things, again, which we have, there are wonderful examples of this in the theological traditions that we can go to and people are increasingly interested in. But we do need to recover that sense, which is also a sense of growing, not necessarily that implies that you aren't ever really saved, but rather, as Gregory of Nyssa says, going from glory into glory, because the riches of God, according to Nyssa, are infinite. One is truly there, but always infinitely making progress.
Yeah, no, I think there's also a really good way of getting into a larger conversation that has become rather popular in our Anthropocene moment, which is to hear the number of very influential, well-funded people who are now talking about the need to escape Earth, to terraform
Yes,
other planet, which is again resting on this false assumption that if we get somewhere else, it's going to be just fine, as if the crucial question isn't the transformation of the habits of being that are creating this world which is so well suited for the flourishing of creaturely life to
yes.
continue in its flourishing.
I remember being in a seminar, creation seminar with a scientist who said we don't need to worry too much about destruction of this planet because science is getting so advanced we can put all our information on a CD-ROM. It was that kind of period, and just teleport it to another planet. And you know, talk about Gnostic. This is that when I talk about the dualism that this doctrine of creation rejects, the idea that I'm just a bunch of information only accidentally connected to my body, not at all. But yet this kind of idea that you know you're only accidentally related to your body and you might be able to just reinvent everything on another planet with a suitably big 3D printer is really a worrying sign, I think.
Yeah. So let's come back to the theme of attention, which I know that you care much about, as do I. And I want you to say a little bit more about the kinds of habits that are important to try to cultivate in people so that something like attention becomes possible. You know, Blake talks about how the windows or the glass of our perceptive capacities have become clouded.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things do we need to do if we're to sort of clean the glass so we can begin to perceive not just the world and each other, but perceive each other as the embodied expression of God's love, as you were talking earlier about with Dante, where love is the power moving the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly helps if you believe that the universe is fundamentally good, that the creation is fundamentally good. And I think that is one of the greatest legacies that the West, indeed Western science, has from Christianity and Judaism, that this creation is good. It's not the good side of a dark creation, dark, which is run by devils or whatever. That certainly helps. But I think simply small practices of attention and it's why I think this is consoling, because I think the whole the needs of our time can become overwhelming to people. They feel that there's nothing I can do. It's beyond me. I can't go rewrite the Paris Agreement. What can I possibly do? And I'm recycling my plastics, and that's good. But I think this idea of simply attending and understanding that attending, whether it can be to a daffodil or some, as a way of kind of freeing ourselves about too much anxiety about ourselves and opening us to being affected by others, by other creatures, and by other people is a good start. And I think then too, thinking very much about the way we live in the world and the worlds we live in very locally. I noticed that Kate Rigby said she was pleased to find the various Christian environmental groups that she's working with as understanding the Dominical command to love God with all your heart, to love your neighbors yourself, as including the other creaturely reality, other creatures as our neighbors. And that, I think, is something that is becoming more common and is very welcome. And if we understand ourselves in this expansive way, as so many things are converging to say we must, I think this is a good start. But we should think particularly too about our local environments and be attentive to it. Perhaps how do things work? One of the striking things that Kate Brown said is that 30 to 50% of our suburban area is dedicated to the automobile in the States. And, you know, this can't go on. So what do we do? She was bringing out the very positive suggestion that a lot of this space could be given over to green space and to gardens. You yourself will know, being around Durham, how much downtown Durham, which is being regenerated, is given to car parks, and how little is given to parks. And, you know, there's some real ironies, even with the Duke campus. There are plenty of trails for the students to run on, but there's very little way students can walk, because as soon as you begin to walk, there aren't pedestrian crossings. You come to big motorway, there's nowhere over it, you know, and whoever's designed the campus has assumed that the students won't want to walk really any place, except for if they're running in their jogging gear. Yeah. And, you know, these are small things we can attend to in a local way, and we need to attend to things like public transport, because it's the poorest of the poor that suffer the most from this, as in, and if we see this on our own doorstep and we can make efforts to correct it, I think we'll see it in the more wider picture as well.
So one of the people who I know informs your thinking about attention is Simone Weil, but also Iris Murdoch. And one of the things that both of them talk about is how we have to learn to get ourselves out of the way of honest perception of another. And so anxiety or insecurity or arrogance or any of the number of kinds of habits or desires that people are in can cloud their ability to perceive another. And so given that we're living in an Anthropocene moment where we know levels of anxiety, eco grief, for instance, are quite high, how do we sort of become aware of how the anxiety that we might be in at this time is affecting our ability to see the world more properly or honestly, or however we might put it?
That's a really important question, and I think that's why your theme for this seminar and for the course is a good one, the place of the human being, because we need to think about that practically in terms of what we do in our actions, but also theoretically, as I've been trying to do today, or theologically or philosophically, whatever. And I think we have to be aware of the dangers of just paralysis here, this eco grief. There is a danger. And one thing that I think is immensely helpful, and we have in the figures you mentioned, Simone Weil as a very eccentric Jew with profound Christian tendencies, and Iris Murdoch as a kind of Neoplatonist, an understanding that, yes, as you say, to some extent, we need to not lose the self, but discover that the self is found by attending to the other, by going outside. It's Iris Murdoch when she ceases to worry about herself and she looks at a hawk in the sky flying, that she finds it's a kind of ecstatic. She can move beyond herself. And I think in another way you can do this within and I think it's Augustine's way, that he sort of resolves the dilemma of know thyself. How can I do that? By saying, well, we can't. And he says in one of his writings, from the very fact we don't even understand ourselves, we can only imagine how little we understand God. And it's not meant to be a negative point, because what he's saying is, well, relax about self-understanding, get rid of the sort of Delphic epithet, and say, know, as Augustine comes to know, he doesn't know who he is. He knows, however, he's known by God, and he's known he's loved by God. And that's enough to free him to get on and do things, which is what we're called to do. So there is a stage, and I don't want this to lend to any kind of passivity. Well, I'm just all right, and God loves me, so I don't need to do anything. That should be a way into a freedom of doing things, if we're not too anxious about ourselves and our grief. But I do think we need to be careful about that. And when I say we, I don't just mean we individually, I mean we collectively, we in the university, we in the public spaces, we need to think about this.
Yeah. So I think just another addendum to that is Gregory of Nyssa says, for instance, that human beings are fundamentally a mystery because they're made in the image of an incomprehensible God. And the question would be, what would it mean for the way we relate to each other if we understood each other to be characterized by this kind of depth, which is so important to, I think, having this ecstatic movement where we're willing to submit to a mystery that's far greater than we can comprehend.
Yes, agreed.
So let's turn now to some questions from our webinar participants. Here's one. I'm curious about the role Sabbath might play in your analysis. Moltmann thinks that Sabbath is one way of remembering the gifted character of creation on the grounds that nature connotes endless or at least automatic fruitfulness, whereas Sabbath recalls that the world is God's and its ongoing fruitfulness is a gift. Does that seem a helpful move to you to bring in the Sabbath?
Yes, and of course it's tied up, as Moltmann well knew, in the Genesis creation narrative that God rested. But of course, God's resting doesn't mean, in terms of the wider creation theology that I've expressed, that God ceased to be God and ceased to be fundamentally holding all reality into being. Were that the case, the world wouldn't exist for a second. So I think that it is a helpful notion, and especially if it's tied up with, another idea of Sabbath rest. Sabbath rest is the baptistries were octagonal in the early church, and this is to reflect that it was on the 8th day. This is a day of resting. So there's quite a lot there. Yes, I do.
Yeah, one of the things, I mean, I have come to think of the Sabbath as very important for our thinking about some of these, because we are often confused about what God's rest entails. And as you say, it can't simply mean an abdication from creation or an escape from it. And so a better way might be to say that it is God's complete immersion into it, so as to experience it in all of its goodness and beauty, as the Sabbath or as the creation poem in Genesis is describing. And so the opposite of rest is not stoppage of activity, but the end of restlessness that doesn't allow us to attend to anything.
Fullness of being, you could say.
Right.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. Another question, the term order has been tied to more repressive theologies and can be a politically loaded term. So is wholeness or interdependence a better term perhaps than order is? Or how would we talk about when an order becomes a bad or malicious order, for instance?
No, that is something that troubles me too, and because of the way order has been used and is used sometimes in the modern time. But that there is a world that is given and we stand before it, we can accept. But I think one of the, it seems to me, the good points of Augustine's concept of ordered and ordered loves is that the ordered loves, he's very, very emphatic about the Dominical command, love God and with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, this command generated a lot of problems. If you love God with all your heart, do you just use leftover bits of love to love your neighbor or your wife or your children? But of course, the way Augustine understands that and the way it gets developed subsequently is to love God with all your heart, isn't to lose your other loves, because God is not a creature amongst creatures. God is the creator. And to love God with all your heart is to understand where everything else comes from, so that you love fully. Your other loves come back to you, your love of your neighbor, and your love of yourself, which, as Augustine rightly pointed out, so many theologians today briskly speak, oh, love God and love your neighbor. But Augustine notes it also involves as yourself, so that you have to love yourself. Well, what's your proper kind of self-love? Again, this is something we're not very good on. And I think Augustine's implication is we love ourselves properly as who we are in God, that is, as loved by God. And if we love ourselves as loved by God and we love others as loved by God, these things will come into the ordering, is the ordering of love towards God. Now, the unfolding of that ordering, I think, is left for human creativity in our understanding of things. So, for instance, it could be that a lot of things that a previous generation of Christians thought were disordered, that we now see in terms of loving God and putting them first, the love of God, unfolds into a different way of understanding that in our own time. So I think the point is that God, and this is something that I think excited Tim Ingold in his metaphysical, that God in being the source of being is not something far away, not something, it's totally active and generating. And we have to view our participation in this, although we participate as creatures, not as God, God's self, as active too, and continually generating new ways of love. So that I think is not the primary ordering, is that ordering, that as it were, ordering towards God in this Christian expression of things. Or I suppose you could say, if you're a Neoplatonist, ordering towards the good, and get to the same, or the different things in Hinduism.
All right, good. So here's a question about the presence of God in the world. So creation ex nihilo excludes pantheism. Do you think that it excludes panentheism?
So
perhaps you could start by just making a distinction between
yeah.
pantheism and panentheism for people who may not know.
Well, pantheism is that God is sort of everywhere equally, and that, for instance, we dissolve into the cosmic mind when we die. Panentheism is that the world is God's body, or that's a rough and ready account. Panentheism, it's quite an interesting question, because classically, theologians, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, have wanted to argue that God did not need to create. It was not. Now, this was in contrast with, for instance, Neoplatonism, that believed that God was just like the sun and had to radiate outwards. And the God in strict Neoplatonism is completely indifferent to what's below. It's not a personal God. That is not basing itself on the scriptural writings. The Abrahamic thinkers have wanted to say God could have chosen not to create, but since this is the creation is creation of space and time, when does this happen? We can't view that as a temporal thing. So God, in a sense, has created and is eternally present to the created order. Now, this Aquinas is very explicit. This eternal in this Christian sense does not mean this, or Maimonides in Jewish sense, the same as Aristotle's view, where the universe is everlasting, back and forth. Eternal means that it's God's presence is a creator of time. So there are really interesting debates as to what in fact that might mean, and how God's presence to the world could ever be absent. So I think that there are elements which could tend in this direction, but one would have to exclude certain kinds of panentheism, where the world becomes more materially God's body. Yet, in a sense, this creation ex nihilo keeps the world fully. I think a lot of what has attracted some modern people to panentheism, some process theologians, is the idea of God's intimacy with the world. But I think one can keep that with classic creation ex nihilo, because God is still utterly present and sustaining it as the creator rather. And we were just in a recent class discussing Julian of Norwich's showings, and at a certain stage she has this experience of seeing the world, or seeing something in her hand. She doesn't say, she's something in her hand, round and roll like a little hazelnut. in her hand.
Mhm.
And it comes to what is this? And it's all that is. It's all that is. And she says, oh, it's so fragile. It could. And she said, and then it comes to her again, no, because God loves it. So all that is, in sense, is entirely contingent. But in another sense, it's entirely not contingent, because God's love is not contingent and is holding all that is in being.
So to speak of the world as intimately, or God being intimately present to the world, raises questions about how we understand God in the context of such histories of violence and injustice, and then now eco-destruction. So I remember years ago reading some Levinas's Talmudic writings, where he said in the passage where Moses goes to be with God on Mount Sinai, and God says, "You can't see my face and live."
Mm-hmm.
Levinas's gloss on that is that the reason people can't see the face of God is that if they were to look into the face of God, they would see reflected back all of the history of pain and suffering and violation.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I remember reading that thinking, this is just a powerful description, but it raises, I think, a really interesting question about how do we think the power of God in the face of so much violation of life, so much pain and suffering, so much destruction of habitats, extinction of species, and that sort of thing. We don't want to get sentimental about the love of God in the world. So how might you talk about the presence of God to the world when this world is subject to so much pain and suffering?
Mm-hmm. Well, I, as you say, this is just a variant. I don't say just a variant. This is a problem of evil. How can there be suffering and pain? And it's been of every generation. And of course, in the midst of this great pandemic, we have to think about the bubonic plague, and the plague that wiped out so many people in the 5th century. Whole cities were taken away. And so we're not the first generation to think about this. And we're not the first generation to say, I don't have an answer. And any answer is going to be very glib. Why did God allow the Holocaust? I think it's almost better to avoid an answer. But what we can say is, as you get in Dostoevsky, I say, if it was up to you to just say, let's just get rid of it all in a second, would you do so? I mean, it is true there is a terrible amount of suffering, and a lot of it is caused by us. Some of it isn't caused by us. Some of it caused, as Simone Weil was constantly saying, by just seeming the unfolding of what we call the natural order. But nonetheless, the groundedness of this gift of being, if we can't imagine that, well, if I had the power to sort of turn the light switch off, would do so, then speaking anthropomorphically, would we think the same of God? Is there not something about the glory and wonder of creation and what's happening within it that makes us feel that overall, it is indeed good.
And it brings us back to something you mentioned earlier with respect to Dante, right? Are people in a position, could they be in a position where they were to be able to see love, God's love, as the power moving through everything?
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
For so many people, it seems that that's become a really difficult possibility.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Dante is interesting because he lived in hellishly difficult times, really. But perhaps where we differ from almost all previous generations is our awareness of the extent to which we've damaged everything, and are damaging everything unwittingly, by wearing fleeces and washing them in washing machines, and that the great worry that we don't have the capacity to recoup on these losses. There's a wonderful poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, The Word is Charged with the Grandeur of God, where he talks about all the smeared, bleared with toil, and bears man sweat and bears man smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. He's talking about industrial Britain. And he ends, and I hope I've got this right, I'm just recalling it, but for all this nature is never spent, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. For the last light over the far west went, thou morning it the eastward brings, because the Holy Spirit over a bent world broods with warm breast and with awe, bright wings. Mm. Now, I love that poem, but I think we have to be aware that many of us feel that maybe the damage is too far, that nature can be spent. But yet here we are talking about it. And we too, if I go back to my reigning theme, we too are natural. We too are part of it. We are not something separate from this. We are part of it. And here we are talking about it. And here we are actively trying to do something about it. So that, I think, is the way we must go. And if human creatures have brought on so much of this, human creatures surely must be the ones who can make the effort to rectify it. You can be sure that mollusks and elephants aren't going to do it, and nor should they have to.
Right. No, I think that's a really good place to end. Activate love is what is the primary task for us in our time. So thank you so much, Janet, for joining us today. Thank you to webinar participants for joining us. And I want you to know that next week, our guest will be Rob McFarlane. So please remember to tune in again for this program in a week's time. So again, thank you so much, Janet, and best wishes to all of you for a fine afternoon.